SPED 2010 students. So I thought I would start here with our course calendar so we can kind of see where we're at in the semester so far and where we're heading. So you'll notice here we just finished Module 3 and we are starting Module 4. One thing that I did want to note is that this module is 2 weeks long. We are covering 2 chapters, so that will give us a little extra time to do those 2. Another thing that I wanted to make note of is if you haven't been using this course calendar, I highly encourage you to download it. It's also located inside the syllabus. And the reason I mention that is because aside from just your homework, there are lots of pre-service learning documents that you have to have completed. As you see here, last week you were supposed to complete your background check as well as purchase your liability insurance and submit the proof to Teams. As well as complete the VECHS waiver. Now coming up, you will see that your referral confirmation form is due. I have had some people email me about that. Some students asked what that was. You will get that from me once you have completed all your paperwork and the service learning coordinator has placed you, and once she has let me know that, I will send you your email with your placement along with that form, and that form will get completed by the principal and the mentor teacher you're with. But until you are cleared by the service learning coordinator, you are not going to be getting that form, okay? So it's very important for you to work on that, and then she get you placed, and then I will send that form to you. Now, this form does not mean you can begin your hours. It just means that you will reach out, and I will tell you who you need to reach out to in the email, and set a time so you can meet with them, meet with the teacher, get the teacher and the principal to fill out the form, and then at that point, you will set your schedule of when you're going to be coming in to do your 12 hours. And then I will also give you a expectations letter. That way you can give it to your teachers so they know the expectations as well of what's expected of you and what they're supposed to be helping you with while you're in their classroom. So that will also get emailed to you. So for Module 4, we're going to be working in Chapter 4 and 5 in our textbook, and we're really going to look at disabilities, specifically high incidence disabilities and low incidence disabilities. And really our focus for you to understand the difference between the two. Really, the focus on the first section is high incidence, and we really stress that because these are the types of students you're going to see most likely in your room, but we also have to look low incidence as well. One thing that's also noted here is that in addition to doing another IRIS module, you will be doing a discussion this week, this module as well. And we will be going into behavior, learners who have emotional and behavior disorders. So let's go ahead and get into the module overview and outcomes and start there. So as I mentioned, our focus is going to be on individuals who have high incidence disabilities. So these would include things like intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, maybe some students who have speech or language impairments, emotional disturbance. Those are the ones that you're going to see a lot in these types of classrooms. We're going to examine those. Another thing to think about too is that ADHD is one that you're going to see as well in that category. So when we turn our attention to Chapter 5, that's going to be really focusing on those pupils who have low incidence disabilities, like maybe it's a sensory impairment, deaf blindness, a physical or health disability, something like traumatic brain injury. So those are the ones that we'll dive in with that. So as you can see here, here's our course outcomes and then our learning objectives. So we do have the curriculum map in getting started, so you can see how each module and learning objective is connected to our course outcomes and what activities will assess that. So this module, I really want you to be able to identify the difference between the high incidence disabilities and low. I want you to be able to define those terms, like a student who has speech and language impairment, what does that mean? What are some of those characteristics? We're going to also identify those students in the low disability, the low incidence disability group. And then really diving into, as well as that behavior portion, those behavior learning disorders, those characteristics, right? And also what are the characteristics of those low incidence such as sensory impairment, deaf blindness, physical disabilities, those sorts of things. So that's going to be our focus for Module 4. So as we dive into the course objectives, I always start with that because in the module objectives, I want you to see where we're going. Like, what do I want you to get out of this module? At the end of the module, you should be able to do this, and it's helping us meet our course objectives. We also have our key terms and concepts here. This is important because these are the ones that you're going to be seeing throughout chapters 4 and 5, but you may also see it inside the module itself. So this is the IRIS module. So this is just going to help you get a better understanding of what these words mean and be able to define them. And then lastly, I give you the standards, letting you look at what the standards are, because that way you can see how is this course lining up with in-task standards, which, as you know, those are the teacher preparation standards, which that's what you are going into that field. And then we also have to include the Council for Exceptional Children standards. Those are also important. Okay, so one thing I do want to note too, if we go back up here to this module section here, whenever we're looking at keywords and concepts, a lot of students want to just kind of rush through this. Please don't, because this section really helps you. I would even suggest, like, if you are keeping a reading organizer or an outline or some kind of study tool, I would paste these inside of that. I feel like that's most helpful for me if I understand the terminology while I'm reading the textbook chapter. So I just wanted to go back and note that. So the learning resources I give you, obviously the first section here is telling you which chapters, and I'm going to go over and really highlight in just a minute of what I want you to focus on in each chapter. But you have Chapter 4, PowerPoint and Outline, and Chapter 5, PowerPoint and Outline. Please keep in mind, these are kind of short. They're just highlighting little snippets of it. Really, you do still need to read the textbook because there's a lot of stuff left out of the PowerPoint as well as the outline. So just keep that in mind. So before we get into the activities and assessments, let's go ahead and dive into Chapter 4 and 5 and note some things I want you to be looking at. So in Chapter 4 is when we're going to be starting with the high incidence disabilities. So something that you're going to note is there's some graphs in here which are very helpful, but one of the things to focus on is really looking at the tables. The tables, I don't know if you've noticed so far, the tables are very helpful because it gives you a visual, like a breakdown of what we're talking about in the content. So for example, on page 84, if you look at table 4.1, I want you to look at that section because it really starts to talk about adaptive skills and what those are. And when we're talking about adaptive skills, it's important for you to see how this is related to the disabilities, right? When we're looking at each child's developmental period. So table 4.1, it's really going to give you those examples of what we mean by practical adaptive skills, but we're breaking it into the 3 components. We're looking at conceptual, social, and practical, and what that means in the classroom. So make sure that we look at that. Another thing too that's important is table 4.2 because it really talks about classification. Now, why is classification important? Classification is important because we're trying to measure the intelligence when we're talking about those who may have intellectual disability, right? Or learning disability. So how they categorize or classify, if you will, is by mild, moderate, severe, or profound. So it's important for you to understand that as you're moving forward when we're looking at intellectual disabilities. Now, to go with table 4.2, 4.3 goes a little step further. Instead of just saying mild, moderate, severe, profound, it's looking at what kind of support level they would need, right? So would it be intermediate, would it be limited, extensive, pervasive, and what would those description as well as examples be? So that's important for you to understand. Now, table 4.4, going along with intellectual disability, is what are some of those behavior characteristics that you're going to see in that child, right? One of the things I did want to note to you, and it's going to be in your keywords and concepts, is learned helplessness. The reason this is important is because a lot of times students who have an exceptionality, we're going to use exceptionality and disability interchangeably, they have what we call learned helplessness, where they depend too much on a individual. So the individual could be a peer, an adult, the parent, and we really have to look at ourselves in the classroom as teachers, because our first inclination is to jump in there. But I feel like it's important for you to know in this section on page 87 in table 4.4, you're going to see learned helplessness right there when it breaks down their behavior characteristics. So that was something important to note. Now, when we're talking about how do you approach learners who have intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities, page 89, table 4.5 is great, because it's really going to talk about, okay, what's the RTI approach and what's the traditional approach when we are trying to meet learners and support them. So pay attention to that as well. Now, page 91 will kind of go into some of the behavior characteristics for students who have learning disabilities, so look at that as well. Then we move into what we call the speech and language students. This is important because you're going to have probably, if you're working in a gen ed classroom, you're going to see students who may have speech and language, right? So table 4.6 is really going to break down the different kind of components of language. I do want to caution you, it can be a lot to like read through this section. You don't have to memorize and know all of this. What I want you to get out of this is just kind of seeing how it works together, what are their characteristics like, what are some signs that they may have speech and language impairment, and then what can you do to help in the classroom and support that child. So that's really what that focus is on that section. And then also on page 97, I want you to pay attention to table 4.8, where it talks about behaviors. Now this section is crucial because you're going to have students in your classroom who have learning and behavior disorders. This section specifically is, this table, if you will, is looking at behavior resulting in teacher referrals, right? But also when we're looking at things we don't understand, we think, oh, they might be a behavior child. We need to be able to classify what we're talking about. So how those two are connected is important. Now, how would they, exhibit these behaviors? What's the etiology? All of this is going to be important for you to look at. Another section that is important on page 102 is where we talk about autism spectrum, which is also a high incidence category or disability. So this is one that we're going to pay attention to, and it's quite a few pages long. So it's going to start on page 102, and it's going to go to, I think it will stop on page 107. On page 106, there is a table that is helpful. It's, again, giving you those characteristics. I really like how this textbook set up the tables for you to get snippets. Like, everything is in one place to show you, okay, these are the characteristics as a teacher that you might see them exhibiting these. So this is helpful for you to look at. And again, that's table 4.11, so 4.11. And then we also, to finish out the chapter, are going to be looking at ADHD. This is something that you're going to see a lot of in your classroom, whether you're gen ed or you go specifically in SPED. So table 4.12, again, is giving those characteristics representative of a child who has that. Now, the book will go into definitions, the environmental factors, but one thing to know always is the characteristics, but also the supports, right? So what is important for you to understand about that, and then how can you support them in the classroom? The last thing about chapter 4, and it's in a lot of the chapters, I really like is when it gives a student's story. So on page 113, there's one called Today's Students, Michael. And it's really, remember, this book it has a lot in it. And remember, as I explained in the beginning when we first started, this course gives you one snippet, one little midge of the tip of the iceberg. There's so much to special ed, and we can't do it all in one classroom. There's no way for you to learn all this unless you're specifically going into the field of special education. But one thing I want to notice is that when we are reading our textbook chapters and you see stories like this is today's classroom, yeah, and this textbook, Universal Design for Learning Approach, really is going to help you meet all the diverse learners. It doesn't have all the answers. It's not going to give you all the information unless you're specifically studying that when you get to university. But take advantage of these sections in the book that gives you a snippet into the type of student and what's going on. I really feel like it's helpful. And then on page 114, you have one called Today's Student Sam. So look at those as well. Now, at the end of each chapter, you're always going to see a page that will have like a thematic summary. This is important because it just summarizes the chapter. But also it has two different sections following that, almost like a think, write, apply, if you will, right? So I always encourage you as a study tool to do those because this is why you're making connections, right? For inclusive teaching. These questions are amazing. And as we're studying, and once you get into the actual classroom, start connecting what we're learning in this textbook and in this class to your field experience. It's going to be helpful. It also has learning activities, as I mentioned, which is also helpful for you as a study tool. So please make sure that you look at that. Now, moving on to chapter 5. So chapter 5, again, is going to be low incidence disabilities, right? That category. So I'm going to jump in and tell you the ones I want you to focus on, okay? So hearing impairments, obviously I want you reading about that. Again, it really gives you the biology factors, if you will, the health factors, but it's important for you to kind of understand that, like, for instance, on page 121, table 5.2, it really dives into the impact of hearing loss on students. So this is important. So I would pay attention to that table. It also will continue on page 122. But you should also look at what are some indicators. So what would you be seeing in the classroom if there are some sort of something going on with their hearing loss that you might notice that could be helpful for you to draw attention to this and mention this to mom and dad or the parent. So table 5.3 is really good to look at. Now moving on from hearing, we're going into visual. Braille, it talks about Braille in the textbook. If you're not familiar with that, it is a way for a student to be able to read, right? So if they're legally blind, we have something called braille. It's kind of like a tactile means that if a student is visually blind, they will be able to read print, right? So the picture card on page 5.2, this is an example of what a braille card with alphabet letters would look like, and what the system is comprised of with the dots. So if you're not familiar with that, I feel like this section would be helpful for you. It talks about the etiology of visual impairments. Also, table 5.4 gives you some really good indicators. If you see the children doing this, so say they're rubbing their eyes a lot, or they're holding the objects really close. Their kind of eyes are always itchy and watery. And these are just some things that you might take note of that you're seeing that you may want to speak to the parents about. Now, it moves into deaf blindness. So we're going to make sure that we look at that section. Remember, these are low incidence, so they're not going to be categories that you would see or the types of disabilities you might see very often, but it's important for you to know the different types and classify them because it's going to help you should you have this type of student in your classroom or this type of disability that you're seeing. Obviously, it talks about communication for students who are deafblind. Obviously, we talk about the ASL. We talk about sign language, how the students use it, how can you help them in the classroom. And then table 5.5 is really great because when we start getting into the health disabilities, it could be a lot. You feel like, oh, I have to memorize all this. Table 5.5 is really just looking at what are definitions of describing some of these health disabilities that you might see, like say traumatic brain injury, if there's some sort of orthopedic impairment, multiple disabilities. So maybe for instance, they have an intellectual disability plus maybe they have deaf blindness, right? So they fall in more than one category. So looking at those as well. Now, other health impairment is if they were, say they had seizures, it would fall under that category. Say they have epilepsy. So these are something for you to be aware of. You wouldn't see very often, but it's important for you to know that that's one type of the health disability. That will finish chapters 4 and 5. I just obviously want you to read both chapters. You have 2 weeks to complete this. But I did want to kind of hone out the important graphs and tables that I feel that will help you make a connection, because it is a lot when they throw in the biological factors and etiology and how this kind of came to be. But learning the characteristics is important. How do you support them? What should you be looking for? So all of this, and just knowing what it is, number one, is going to help you. Now, let's move into how are you going to be assessed this week. So you will obviously be completing the IRIS module here. Now, the IRIS modules are a way to help you. It's almost like professional development, but I always say it's good because it's giving you what the book can't, right? It's giving you professional development in the sense that there's audio videos in there, there's audio interviews in there, there's videos, there's mock-up of classrooms. So it's going to give you a more hands-on approach, if you will, and give you a better look into a real classroom with these things we're talking about. So the one I chose for you is the IRIS module that's called Autism Spectrum Disorder. And these are going to be evidence-based practices, which means they're research practices that will help you if you have students who have autism. So how do you support them? Now, obviously, when you finish with the module, there's always that assessment tab, which you should always click on. This is going to give you feedback if you actually understand the things that you went through. Now, you are not going to submit your responses to Dropbox, but I still would like you to use it. It's a personal study tool for you to help you with the quiz. So this is what it will look like when you click on it. Again, I said once you go through, and as you see here, it's got different age levels to help you, which is useful. You go through the IRIS module by clicking the next button, and then there's also, you can click through the table of contents, which is another way to navigate through the module. Now, the assessment tab is the one I was saying that I always encourage you to do, because it gives you inclination of real world experiences through these videos and ask you questions and get you to really think about what you've learned in this module and apply it, which is what we want you to do as a classroom teacher. So after you complete the module and you do the assessment, you are going to complete a discussion board. And this discussion board is going back to that section in high incidence disabilities in chapter 4. So we're going to concentrate on learners with emotional or behavioral disorders. So once you click on it, it's going to take you here, okay? You will need your textbook to help you with this assignment, okay? So it's going to give you an introduction to high incidence disabilities, specifically looking at the term emotional disturbance, right? What does that refer to? Someone who is experiencing emotional or behavioral disorders, right? And remember, with these disorders, they can have a broad range of characteristics, right? We can't profile them in one single group. That's why they categorize them as emotional disturbance. So if we're relating you in the classroom as a teacher, and you're going to be applying the UDL principles, right, to meet all your learners' needs, that's going to include meeting the needs of those who have emotional or behavior challenges. So you are going to do this activity. What you're going to do is go back to chapter 4 in your textbook, okay? And I want you to go to the section that specifically talks about emotional or behavioral disorders, okay? So this starts it will start, let me find it. It's going to start on, I just had it, bear with me. Okay, page 96, okay? You're going to read through that section, and what you're going to be looking for when you're looking at table 4.8 and you're reading about emotional behavior disorders, and you're looking at behavioral warning signs and learning characteristics, what I want you to get is I want you to create a list of activities that could be beneficial for someone who might have emotional behavior disorder. Now, you don't only have to use a textbook. You can use research and figure out what activities would support. Now remember, you need to keep in mind UDL, Universal Design for Learning, because those are the principles we want you to apply in the classroom. So you're going to pick activities that support general education content, okay, but also that address the impact of the student's disability and how it impacts them in and outside the classroom. And you're going to share your list of activities with the group, okay? So I do have a rubric here of how I'm going to grade you on the assignment. I'm not giving you a template to go by because I want you to do this in a Word document, but one of the things you're going to do is think about which activities would support them academically, but also for their everyday lives, right? So inside and outside the classroom. And don't forget that you're going to respond to at least 2 posts. So when I'm thinking about a list of activities, that's going to be at least 3 to 5 or maybe even more. I want you to have quite a few on there because this is going to allow us to read each other's activities, and maybe you didn't think of one that might help them. But like I said, you don't only have to stick with the textbook. You could also use outside resources. If you do use outside resources, I do want you to cite it in your Word document though, right? So don't forget to post your document inside of the new thread. You can name it Module 4 Learners with Emotional or Behavior Disorders Discussion. That way, that should be the name of your Word document file, and you would just post it in here. And then I do want you to reply. Remember, this is providing insightful thoughts and suggestions. Great job, I agree with you, is not a comment that is insightful. It's not adding anything to the discussion. Just keep that in mind when you are making replies to your classmates. And then lastly, you will be doing your Module 4 quiz. And again, you do have multiple attempts at the quiz, so please take advantage of that. The module, the IRIS module, has to be completed by March 2nd. The behavior discussion has to be completed by March 2nd, and so does the quiz. It will close March 2nd. So again, you have 2 weeks to complete your assignments and to read chapters 4 and 5. All right, don't forget about service learning. If I am sending emails out, people are already being placed. So if you have questions or you're confused about it, please make sure that you get in contact with me. Also, if you were one that I spoke with about the work-based learning, please email me because we need to finalize before you go into the classroom. All right, guys, I hope you have a great couple of weeks. I won't be sending another video out for a couple of weeks, so just please keep that in mind. But I'm always here to answer any questions or meet if we need to. All right, take care.